The Baroque era, in my experience, has been the era that students in music appreciation really start to like the course a bit more. Um, in my mind, the Baroque era is really where the modern age begins. You're going to see some examples here on the next few slides of some literary works that a lot of you are going to be familiar with. We're gonna start running into some composers' names that you will be very familiar with. The music sounds a lot more familiar because of the development of the major minor tonal system, and we'll talk about that more later. It becomes a lot more instrumental. It's not the modal choral works that we heard in the medieval and Renaissance. So you're starting to hear works written for organ or for violin or for orchestra and things like that. So it starts to be a lot more familiar to you, a lot more modern sounding. And for that reason, I think people tend to start warming up to some of the things that we're looking at during the Baroque era. You certainly don't have to memorize these things, but just a few historical events to kind of set the context for the era that we're talking about. Jamestown in Virginia and the colonies in the New World here was founded in 1607. You got Galileo confirming that the earth revolves around the sun. Louis XIV reigned in France during this time period. We saw some major literary works that were written during this time. This was the age of Shakespeare, Milton, Paradise Lost, John Locke's philosophies, the essay concerning human understanding, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and Swift's Gulliver's Travels. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of or read several of these works. So if you look at this list, there are a couple names that you're going to be very familiar with right away, and that's Johann Sebastian Bach and George Frederick Handel. Some of you are going to be familiar with Vivaldi as well. The biggest name on this list that you've probably never heard of, well, we did talk about him a little bit in the Renaissance because he was a transitional figure, was Claudio Monteverdi, one of the most influential composers in history that I think largely because of the shadow that Bach casts, Monteverdi has largely been overlooked, but fantastic composer. So these are the people that we're going to talk about during this unit. We already know that music intensifies emotion. And during the Baroque era, composers had a desire to ramp up the emotional states. They had a desire to help listeners experience music at a deeper level. During this time, we saw the development of new instrumental genres. We also saw refinement of instrument building and performance techniques. Composers experimented with works that were intensely expressive very early in the period, but by the later Baroque, there was more of an interest in greater predictability of musical form and procedure. Now, the Baroque era in general is all about drama, it's all about theatrics and contrast, and it's not coincidental that this was the era that the opera was developed. In order to sing opera, singers had to be trained. They became much more virtuosic, which made the amateur singing tradition of the Renaissance seem a bit outdated and boring by comparison. The days of the Baroque period are roughly 1600 to 1750, which is roughly about the time that the first opera was composed, and around 1600. It was actually about 1597, but we'll round up. And 1750 was the date that Johann Sebastian Bach died, so those were a couple monumental events that kind of frame this period. This was also a period of change, of adventure, of discovery. This is the age of the discovery. This is the conquest of the New World. And this stirred the imaginations of the people back in Europe, and it also happened to fill the treasuries of much of Western Europe. It was also an age of intellectual milestones. You had Galileo and Copernicus with their discoveries in physics and astronomy, Rene Descartes and his work in mathematics, Spinoza, philosopher who is, by the way, still very relevant today. Uh, he wrote about the control of passions. He wrote about he laid the foundations of democratic thought. He was very critical of the pretensions of scripture and sectarian religion. Harvey was a physician who explained the circulation of blood, and then obviously Sir Isaac Newton and his theory of gravity. This was also a time that empires began to really clash for control of the globe. It was an age of contrasts. Poverty versus wasteful luxury. Idealism on one hand, oppression on the other. Baroque art it demonstrated vigor. It featured elaborate decoration and grandeur. It projected the pomp and the splendor of the era. The term Baroque was actually applied in retrospect to describe excessively extravagant. It came from the Portuguese word meaning distorted or misshapen. It started out as a derogatory term. This was an era of absolute monarchies. Louis the XIV, his famous statement, "I am the state." And that kind of exemplified how art, culture, and everything served the ruler. His court at Versailles was a model for courts throughout Europe, and courts, whether they were big or little, they maintained elaborate musical establishments of opera troupes, chapel choirs, orchestras. Opera was a favorite aristocratic diversion, and nobility kind of imagined that they saw themselves in the gods and the heroes who were the characters and subjects of the opera. We had a growing middle class culture during this time. Now, the middle class was excluded from aristocratic salons, so they created their own culture. Music making for the middle class primarily took place in their homes. The comic opera and the novel were created for the middle class, and they were full of witty observations on life. Religion during the Baroque period, this was still an intensely devout period. Religion was at the heart of many bloody battlefields between Catholics and Protestants. Keep in mind the Protestants were centralized primarily in northern Germany, northern Europe, England. Catholics, the big groups of Catholics were the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs. But this spilled over and it carried over into the New World as well. Protestant refugees settled on the east coast of North America, about where the 13 original colonies would eventually be. The Spanish Catholics settled in the parts of the New World that would later become Mexico, Central America, and the southwest United States. French Catholics settled lands that would later become Canada, the Mississippi Valley, and the Gulf Coast down around New Orleans. Martin Luther's call for religious reform led to the Catholic response, the Counter-Reformation, and we talked about that in the last unit. We saw Milton wrote his work Paradise Lost, which was it was a Protestant point of view that was answering Dante's Divine Comedy, which was a Catholic perspective that had been written a couple centuries before. Artists in the society were primarily employed by royal or princely patronage system, or they could be employed by some church or city administration. Whichever case it was, artists were in direct contact with their public. Something that's very important to understand here is that works were created for a very specific occasion and immediate use. And an artist would be paid to create an opera, for instance, for somebody's wedding, or a dance suite for a festival, maybe a cantata for religious service. This wasn't a time when you got inspired and sat down and wrote because the sun was beautiful and the birds were chirping and, whatever. No, composers wrote for a specific purpose, and that was they were simply paid to do it. I want to take a look at a couple sculptures here to kind of demonstrate the Baroque period. Here we see David by Michelangelo. Now, this famous sculpture was done actually in the Renaissance, and if you look at this, you notice that it's very balanced, it's very calm, very static. It looks like David posed for this sculpture. You can see over his shoulder he's holding the sling. He has just killed Goliath. His hair is nice and neat, and he's posing for what's essentially a photo op. Okay, it does look lifelike. He's got the contrapposto stance going there, where you see where his weight is distributed on, or his weight is basically balanced on one leg, and the other leg is kind of, the knee is bent and stepping forward. It's almost like he's waiting in line in the grocery store, and a little bit bored, nude, but kind of bored standing in line. But in any case, you see that it has a very posed appearance, and we'll contrast that with the sculpture on the next slide. Now here we see the same subject matter, David, by a Baroque sculptor, Bernini, and you notice immediately how different this sculpture is. He's moving. And this kind of reveals the Baroque love for the dramatic. He's in motion. He's in the act. He's not posing for a sculpture to be done. He's actually in the act of taking off the head of Goliath. It's much more dynamic than Michelangelo's David from the Renaissance. And this is, and his hair's not perfect. You can see it's kind of messy. It's like we're just walking in. It's almost like the difference between, I guess, the Renaissance and the Baroque is you could say the Renaissance is like a posed portrait, where the Baroque is more like a candid shot, an action shot. Staying on the subject of art and drama and that, let's take a look at this painting by Rubens, The Descent from the Cross, and immediately again you see that you've walked in on the action. You've walked in as they're taking Christ down from the cross after he's been crucified. And a couple things should strike you here in addition to the motion. If you'll notice that there's diagonal motion, you're going to see a lot of diagonal lines start to appear in Baroque art. Baroque artists became interested in forming a total illusion, kind of like a stage setting. You also see that there's kind of contrast between light and dark. You've got the black background and the white body of Christ, and the wrapping that they're getting ready to cover him with. You also see your attention is drawn right to the center of the painting with the individual wearing the red cloak. And here we see another example of some of the things that we were talking about. Again, this is certainly not a posed picture. This is something where you're walking in on some very gruesome action. But again, you see dramatic uses of colors, the reds, the whites, the blacks and whites, and again diagonal lines within the painting showing motion. Great deal of emphasis on drama. Quickly, we see this self-portrait of Rembrandt, and just to, and a couple other themes that we've been talking about, contrast between light and dark, and when you look at this painting, you see that he's flawed. I mean, he's aged here. He's not perfect. You see wrinkles in his forehead and on his brow. You see where he's got wrinkles in the face and pocks on his nose, and this is very lifelike. It's not idealized at all the way that we would have seen in the Renaissance. You're seeing, and the thing that I'd like to point out here too is you're kind of seeing the psychological truth of this portrait. You can almost see the age and the pain and just the life experience when you look into his eyes. Okay, so this is again humanism we talked about back in the Renaissance period, but it's growing. It's becoming more ingrained in people's lives, and it's becoming more widespread within the arts. We had mentioned before that the Baroque term was used to basically label extravagance. And when you look here, this is the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace at Versailles. And I've had students ask me before, he says, well, how many chandeliers did Louis need? And my response to them was always, well, that's not the right question. The right question is, how many could he fit? And what I'd like you to do is just take a moment and look at this and find a place on the ceiling that is not decorated. Find a place on the floor that is not decorated. It's like everywhere you look is ornamentation. And that is the extravagance, that's the opulence, that's the display of wealth that characterizes the Baroque period. Incidentally, it's also the very thing that is going to make some of these characteristics of the Baroque go out of fashion. And we'll see this when we get into the classical period, the contrast between the two, when you get a return to simplicity. And that's in direct rebuttal or response to the elaboration, the excessive ornamentation that we will see here in this architecture. You see it in the Baroque art, and you will hear examples of it in some of the pieces of Baroque music. A very significant characteristic of music in the early Baroque is the shift from polyphony to homophony. This was called a new style, and it was simply a melody played over just simple chords. Now, this was developed by the Florentine Camerata, and this is a group of aristocratic, humanist writers, artists, and musicians. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to resurrect ancient Greek drama, and they believed that the ancient music heightened the emotional power of the text. Now, they didn't know that. We don't have any notated examples of ancient music. We didn't know what it actually sounded like. But what they did do is they sat around and they talked about this, and they kind of hypothesized that it must have. And so they kind of came up with their own take on that, their own proposal on what that must have been like. New harmonic structures that were used during this time. The first and a very important one was something called the figured bass, which was a type of musical notation. This is actually Claudio Monteverdi's contribution. It was a type of musical notation where the bass note was given along with a number that would have been written above the bass note. And what that did was that indicated the type of chord that was going to be played. So what would happen is the performer filled in the rest of the harmony in his or her own style, his or her own way. So different performers could actually perform the exact same piece of music somewhat differently, at least in the harmonic part of the piece. This system was called basso continuo, or continuous bass. And this was the foundation over which the vocal or instrumental melody could unfold. The basso continuo was usually, it could be one or more instruments. It could be a harpsichord, which, by the way, is a dead giveaway. 9 times out of 10, if you ever hear a harpsichord being played in the background, you know you're listening to music of the Baroque period. But anyway, it could be a harpsichord. It could be a lute, which is a plucked stringed instrument that's the predecessor to the modern-day guitar. It could be a bassoon, or it could be any combination of these. Okay, so that's the basso continuo. And this all led to the establishment of a major-minor tonality. And this major-minor system is basically based upon a hierarchy of notes. That all the notes, all the chords push to a key note, a tonic note. Okay, that tonic note is the most important note in the entire piece, and every other piece is subordinate, or I'm sorry, every other note is subordinate to that keynote, and they all have a specific function, which is what we mean by functional harmony. It's the you're going to start with a tonic and move away from that tonic and then move back to it, and it's almost like a gravitational pull. So this functional harmony, and then not only that, but the ability to move from one key area to another, help to shape musical structure. Because of this, instrumental music or instrumental forms could now be longer than they had ever been before. So now instead of 1.5, 2-minute pieces, we can go into 5, 10, 15, 20-minute pieces, and eventually beyond that. A major technical advance that allowed all this to happen was what they call an equal temperament training system. In fact, I've heard this referred to as one of the big bangs in the history of music. This increased the harmonic possibilities. Instruments now could play in any major and minor key. Basically, it's this. If you imagine you're sitting down in front of a piano and you can find a C, and you count up to the next note that's exactly the same, the next C, you have a distance of 8 notes. It's called an octave. And if you start counting white and black keys, you're going to cover the span of 12 notes in between that octave. That's equal temperament. What that means is each one of those notes is the same distance apart as each one of the other notes. That wasn't always the case. When you got back into medieval and Renaissance, really late medieval and into the Renaissance, there could be infinite number, well, I guess infinite's probably stretching it a bit, but there could be a much greater number of divisions in between that octave. And if you're playing a stringed instrument, a non-fretted stringed instrument, for instance, you could almost come up with an infinite number of divisions in between that. But some people might have 20 divisions, some might have 30 or 40 or whatever, but you get the idea. And the point here is, before equal temperament, a C sharp and a D flat were not the same note. Those of you musicians in the room will be able to appreciate that. Those were two different notes. And what they did with equal temperament was they basically kind of monkeyed with the mathematical ratios and kind of squeezed the notes together and created this system where each of them were equal distant apart. Now, the other thing that did was it enabled it enabled instrument players to be able to play with each other. Instruments from different instrument families to be able to play with each other. If you went from one country to another country, per se, you would be able to play their music. It would sound fine. You could now play in any major and minor key that you wanted to without having horrible sounds result. Johann Sebastian Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier is a great example of this. This is the first time that a composer actually made use of this. This is a 2-volume keyboard collection, and each volume consists of 24 preludes and fugues, one in every possible major and minor key. Now, the Baroque expressive style continues this melodic expansion. What it does is it takes a motive and repeats it and varies it with almost endless modification. This is also a term that music theorists will know as sequencing. It's very similar to the elaborate figures in Baroque architecture. The Baroque quest for motion is very evident in the driving rhythms of the music. Dissonant chords were used very freely to intensify emotion and to add color. You had a more nuanced contrast in dynamics than you did in the Renaissance, and you had much more precise emotional expression. Baroque music features dramatic forte and piano contrast, or terrace dynamics, where it would go from very loud to very soft, with no gradation in between the two. Echo effects were very common. Later 17th century music was built on a single affection or emotion. In other words, if a piece started out sad, it ended sad. If it started out joyful, it ended joyful. It didn't move around a whole lot. That's fairly unique to the Baroque period because that is not going to be the case once we get into the classical era and beyond. It's during the Baroque era that we really start to see the rise of the virtuoso musician. There's a few reasons for that, and it actually becomes kind of a cyclical situation of which came first, chicken or the egg kind of a scenario. But we see an instrumental virtuosity. There was a refinement of instrument building. The instruments got better, the technology got better, so the instrument builders made better instruments. And because of this, performers were able to do more things on them. It led to more advanced playing techniques. Because the playing techniques were getting better, composers start to write more challenging pieces. Okay, so because the composers were writing more challenging pieces, instrument builders were forced to build better instruments. Because of the better instruments, the players had to get better to be able to deal with them. Because the players were getting better to play on these new instruments, composers were writing harder music, and you can see it just starts to spiral upwards. This is also when you have the development of vocal technique. It coincided with the rise of opera. It's exemplified by castrato, which were male singers. They had been castrated at boyhood. And they did this to preserve the soprano and alto registers of their voices. Their voices were very agile. They had an enormous range, incredible breath control. And believe it or not, the castrato were associated with a heroic male role. At this time, if you were a villain in opera, you actually were a bass voice. The hero had the high-pitched voice of the castrato. Women's roles also began to expand during this time. You had professional singers, especially within the world of opera. Improvisation played a very significant role as well. There was not only did musicians have to elaborate on simple harmonies like we talked about with the figured bass, but they also were expected to add embellishments to written melodies. So the music that was heard might have been quite different from what was written, and that was pretty much expected. A lot like what you would see with a modern jazz band. Opera in particular was full of exoticism, and one of the reasons for this was because of the voyages of exploration. And the operas and the musical works made reference to distant lands. Now, they only had to spark the imagination. They didn't really worry about authenticity at all. They just had to evoke the image. So if you heard a particular type of music, it made you think of a particular country or time or whatever. There was also an exchange that was experienced among national cultures. And they call this internationalization, and they combine different qualities into one style. For example, the sensuous melodies that were associated with Italy. You had precise dance rhythms of the French. You had the polyphonic texture of the Germans and the light-hearted choral song of England, all kind of wrapped into one. The result here was a common purpose and style of music. And what we saw was that there was more interest in what made people equal rather than what made them different.